It began on a quiet, uneventful night, the kind where the world feels utterly ordinary. I was in my living room, sprawled on the couch with a book one wasn't really reading. The hum of the ceiling fan filled the air, blending with the faint chirp of crickets outside. It was a peaceful routine I'd fallen into after moving into this house, a modest, two-story place at the edge of the suburbs. The kind of home where you could close the blinds, lock the doors, and forget the world existed. At least that's what I thought. It was past midnight when I decided to head upstairs. My eyes burned from staring at the pages, and the prospect of crawling under a warm blanket was irresistible. I turned off the lights as I went, each switch plunging the house into deeper darkness. In my bedroom, I flicked on the lamp by my bedside and pulled back the curtains just enough to let in the glow of the streetlight. That faint orange light had always been a comfort, a quiet reminder that I wasn't completely alone. That's when I saw him. A man stood on the sidewalk just outside my house. My first thought was that he was a jogger taking a late-night stroll, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, it became clear he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, and he was looking at me. I froze, my hand still clutching the curtain. He wore a crimson suit, deep red, almost unnaturally, vibrant against the shadows of the street. The color stood out in a way that made it hard to look away, like it didn't belong in this world. His face was obscured, hidden by the angle of the street light and the brim of a hat that matched his suit. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel his gaze, fixed on me with a chilling intensity. I swallowed hard, trying to rationalize. Maybe he was drunk or lost. Maybe he wasn't even looking at me at all. But as I stood there, frozen in place, he didn't move. He didn't glance away or shift his weight. He just stood there, perfectly still. The logical part of my brain kicked in. I let the curtain fall back into place and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. My fingers trembled as I typed in the number for the non-emergency police line. "There's a man standing outside my house," I told the dispatcher, keeping my voice as calm as I could. "He's not doing anything, but it's unsettling." The woman on the other end asked for my address, her tone practiced and detached. "Is he threatening you?" she asked. "No," I admitted, peeking through the curtain again. The man was still there, his crimson suit glowing faintly under the streetlight. "But he's just standing there, staring." "We'll send someone to check it out," she assured me. "Stay inside and keep your doors locked." I thanked her and hung up, feeling only marginally better. For what felt like hours, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the curtain, waiting for the sound of sirens. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out the silence of the house. Finally, curiosity got the better of me. I stood and pulled the curtain back again, just a sliver, expecting to see the crimson figure still standing there, but he was gone. The street was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the streetlight. The sidewalk where he'd stood was bare, as though he had never been there at all. Relief flooded through me, though it was quickly followed by doubt. Had I imagined him? Had I been so tired that my mind conjured the entire thing? I tried to convince myself that was the answer, but the uneasy feeling in my stomach wouldn't go away. Even as I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin, I couldn't shake the image of the man in the crimson suit, standing so still, staring so intently. The police called an hour later to let me know they'd checked the area. "There's no one out there," the officer said, his voice scratchy through the phone. "Probably just a prank or someone passing through. Let us know if he comes back." I thanked him and hung up, my fingers gripping the phone a little tighter than necessary. It was fine, I told myself. Just a strange man who wandered off. Nothing to worry about. But as I turned off the light and closed my eyes, I couldn't stop myself from glancing at the window one last time. The sidewalk was still empty. But for the first time since moving into this house, I didn't feel alone. I told myself it was over. I spent the day trying to forget the man in the crimson suit. It wasn't easy. His image stuck with me, the vivid red of his clothing, The unnerving stillness of his posture, the heavy weight of his unseen gaze. But I told myself it was just a one-time thing, a random, unsettling encounter with a stranger who had no reason to come back. It was around 11 p.m. when I started to feel it again, that prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I sat on the couch in the living room, scrolling through my phone in a half-hearted attempt to distract myself. The television played in the background, some late-night talk show I wasn't paying attention to. The feeling grew stronger. I glanced toward the window, my stomach tightening. The blinds were down, but a faint orange glow seeped through the edges, cast by the streetlight outside. I stood, hesitating, my phone still clutched in one hand. "Don't look," I muttered to myself, shaking my head. There's nothing out there, but I couldn't resist. I crept to the window, pulling the edge of the blinds aside just enough to peek out. My heart sank. He was there. Yeah. The man in the crimson suit stood in the exact same spot as the night before, his motionless form bathed in the dim glow of the streetlight. His face was still obscured, hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but I could feel his gaze, heavy and unyielding, boring into me as though he could see through the walls. This time he was closer. The pit in my stomach deepened. He was standing on the walkway that led directly to my front porch, no more than 10 feet from the house. I let the blind snap shut, stumbling back as my pulse skyrocketed. "What do you want?" I whispered to myself, gripping the edge of the couch for support. My mind raced. Should I call the police again? What would I even say? That he wasn't doing anything, just standing there? I grabbed my phone and dialed anyway. The dispatcher sounded more skeptical this time. "You said he didn't do anything last night?" she asked, her voice flat. "Yes, but he's back," I insisted. "He's closer now, and he's just standing there, staring at my house." She sighed. "We'll send someone to check the area again. Keep your doors and windows locked." I hung up and locked the front door, triple-checking it this time. Then I sat on the couch, clutching my phone and staring at the blinds like they might spring open on their own. The police took their time. When I peeked outside again, the man was gone. The same empty sidewalk greeted me, the faint glow of the streetlight casting long shadows across the pavement. And now, when the officer arrived, I greeted him at the door, my nerves frayed. "He was just there," I said, my voice trembling. "Right there," I pointed to the walkway. The officer shone his flashlight around, stepping into the yard to search the area. "No footprints," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "No sign of anyone." I hugged my arms around myself, feeling small and foolish. Maybe he saw me watching and ran off, I offered weakly. The officer gave me a patient look. "If he comes back again, call us." "But are you sure you're not just imagining things? This neighborhood's quiet, and no one else has reported anything." Usual. I wanted to argue, but I didn't have the energy. Instead, I nodded and watched as he got into his car and drove away. I sat in my room with all the lights on, my back against the wall. Every so often, I'd glance toward the window, half expecting to see that crimson figure pressed against the glass. By morning, I felt like a zombie, but the relief of sunlight gave me enough strength to function. I convinced myself it was over, that he wouldn't come back, but the next night he did. This time, I didn't look right away. I tried to ignore the feeling of his gaze, the way it seemed to press against my skin like an invisible weight. But eventually, my curiosity or my fear got the better of me. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside. He was there again, standing perfectly still on the sidewalk. But this time, he wasn't alone. Another figure stood farther down the street, shrouded in shadows. It was harder to make out, but I could tell they were facing my house too, their posture eerily similar to his. I let the curtain fall, my hands trembling. Whatever this was, it wasn't random, and it wasn't going to stop. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The wrenching fear that had gripped me the first night was now replaced by something worse, a sinking, hollow certainty This wasn't just some stranger playing a twisted prank. The man in the crimson suit wasn't alone anymore, and I had no idea what that meant. I glanced at my phone on the coffee table. Call the police again? What would I even say? Last time, they hadn't found anything, and now there were two of them. Would they even believe me? My hand hovered over the phone as I debated, my heart pounding so loudly it seemed to fill the room. A sudden sound made me jump, a sharp, rhythmic tapping, echoing softly against the glass of my living room window. The phone slipped from my fingers. I didn't want to look. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay still, to pretend I hadn't or heard it. But the tapping came again, deliberate and steady, like a knock from someone who knew I was there. I turned slowly, my muscles stiff with fear, and saw him. The man in the crimson suit was standing directly outside the window. He was closer than he'd ever been before, the glass separating us the only barrier. His hat tilted, slightly downward, obscuring most of his face. But this close, I could just make out the shadowed suggestion of features, a too wide grin and pale, gleaming skin. The tapping came again. He wasn't using his knuckles. His long, thin fingers rested on the glass, the crimson fabric of his gloves tight against his skin. He was using the tip of one finger, tapping slowly, methodically, as if daring me to react. I couldn't move. My body refused to obey. We stared at each other. Or rather, I stared at him. His face, what little I could see of it, remained utterly still. His head tilted slightly to one side, as though he were curious about me, his grin frozen in place. What do you want?" I croaked, my voice barely audible. The tapping stopped. His hand fell back to his side, and for a moment I thought he might answer me. Instead, he reached up with one hand and raised his hat slightly. For the first time, I saw his eyes, or what should have been his eyes. They weren't normal. They were black and hollow, like voids cut into his face. They didn't reflect the light from the street lamp, didn't blink, didn't move. They simply stared. A choked sound escaped my throat, and I stumbled backward, my legs hitting the coffee table. I tripped and fell hard onto the floor. The wind knocked out of me. When I looked up again, he was gone. I stayed there on the floor, too afraid to move. My gaze stayed fixed on the window, half expecting to see him reappear. But the street outside was empty again, as though he'd never been there at all. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the phone, dialing the police with shaking hands. "This is the third night in a row," I said as soon as the dispatcher answered. "He's back," he was, and at my window. He tapped on the glass. "Calm down, Ma," the dispatcher said, though her voice carried a note of exasperation. "Can you see him now?" "Der Kadied." I glanced at the window, my throat dry. "No. But he was just there. Please, send someone now." She assured me an officer was on the way, but I didn't feel reassured. I locked the front and back doors, then checked the windows, making sure they were all shut tight. When the officer arrived, the routine was the same as before. He shone his flashlight over the yard, checked the street, even glanced at the bushes under the window. "There's no sign of anyone," he said finally, lowering the flashlight. "No footprints, no damage." Near to the house. I opened my mouth to argue, but he cut me off. "Look, I'm not saying you're lying," he added, his tone patient. "But maybe it's worth considering other explanations. Stress, lack of sleep. Things like that can play tricks on you." I bit back a sharp reply, my hands clenching into fists. "I'm not imagining this," I said through gritted teeth. The officer gave me a sympathetic look but didn't argue further. "If it happens again, call us," he said before leaving. When I closed the door behind him, the silence of the house hit me like a physical weight. My stomach churned as I stared at the window, the street lamp's glow still seeping faintly through the blinds. I didn't want to look outside again, but the compulsion was too strong. Slowly I approached the window and pulled the blinds aside. My heart stopped. The man in the crimson suit was standing in the middle of the street. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were 3 figures now, all standing perfectly still, all facing my house. The man in the crimson suit was at the front, flanked by 2 others dressed in shadowy, indistinct clothing. Their faces were completely obscured, but they all stood with the same unnatural stillness, their heads tilted slightly toward me. I let the blinds fall and stumbled back, clutching the edge of the couch to steady myself. My pulse roared in my ears, and for the first time since this began, I felt the icy grip of true panic. Whatever this was, it wasn't going away. And it wasn't just him anymore. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, the man in the crimson suit and his silent companions, standing in the street, their heads tilted, their shadowy figures waiting for something. The weight of their gaze still pressed against me, even though the blinds were shut tight. I kept pacing between the living room and the kitchen, clutching a knife I'd grabbed from the drawer. It felt ridiculous, holding a blade against something that didn't even feel human, but it was all I had. At some point, exhaustion won out. I curled up on the couch, still gripping the knife, and let the pale light of dawn streaming through the windows lull me into a restless sleep. I avoided the windows entirely, terrified that if I looked outside, I'd see them again. Even as the sun shone brightly and the world went about its business, the sense of being watched never left me. I tried to go about my day, to clean, to cook, to scroll aimlessly through my phone, but my mind was stuck on the same looping thought: why were they here? The answer came later that afternoon. I was clearing a stack of old newspapers near the front door when I noticed a small, weathered book sticking out from underneath the welcome mat. The cover was blank, the edges tattered, and the pages smelled faintly of mildew. I flipped it open, frowning as I scanned the first few pages. They were filled with disjointed journal entries, handwritten in a scrawled, uneven script. The ink was faded, and the handwriting changed from page to page, as though multiple people had written in it. The first entry was dated decades ago. I saw him again last night. The man in the red suit. He was standing outside, watching. I locked the door, but I swear I heard him tapping on the window. I don't know what he wants, but I can't take it anymore. He's closer every night. My blood ran cold. I flipped to another entry, the handwriting jagged and frantic. He's not alone. There were more of them tonight, just standing there staring. I tried to tell the police, but they said I was imagining it. I'm not. I know I'm not. The last entry was short, the words barely legible. They're inside. The rest of the book was blank. I dropped the journal as if it burned. My mind raced, the implications sinking in like ice. This had happened before to someone else, in this very house. The police hadn't helped them either. I wanted to run, to pack a bag and leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wouldn't matter. The man in the crimson suit wasn't tied to the house, he was tied to me. I sat in the dark living room, every light in the house turned off. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like they wanted me to look for them, to acknowledge them. Maybe that's why they kept coming. Closer. The hours ticked by, each one stretching endlessly. Midnight came and went, and for a moment, I allowed myself to hope that they wouldn't come back. Then I heard it, the tapping. It wasn't at the living room window this time. It was coming from the sliding glass door at the back of the house. My heart seized in my chest as I turned toward the sound. The curtains covering the glass door shifted slightly, as though disturbed by a faint breeze. "Leave me alone," I whispered, clutching the knife tighter. The tapping came again, louder this time. I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I crept toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached for the edge of the curtain and yanked it aside. The man in the crimson suit was standing just outside the glass, his face mere inches from mine. This time I saw his grin in full. It stretched impossibly wide, his teeth sharp and gleaming under the pale moonlight. His hollow eyes stared straight into mine, unblinking, unwavering. Behind him, his companions stood in a loose semicircle, their shadowy forms taller now, more distinct. Their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their arms hanging stiffly at their sides. I stumbled back, my legs giving out as I fell to the floor. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his grin widening further, his head tilting slowly too. To match mine. Then he raised one hand and tapped on the glass again. Tap, tap, tap. The sound echoed in my ears as the lights in the room flickered once, twice, and then went out. Completely. I don't remember how long I sat there in the dark, frozen with fear. When the lights came back on, they were gone. But I knew better than to think it was over. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. When morning came, it brought no relief. The world outside seemed the same as it always had. The sun warm and bright, the neighborhood alive with the sounds of life. Yet, inside the house, the air felt heavy, as though the previous night's terror had sunk into the walls, clinging to every surface. So, I hadn't slept. My body ached from exhaustion, but my mind refused to shut down. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the windows sent my nerves into a spiral. The journal sat on the coffee table where I'd left it. I kept glancing at it, debating whether to open it again. The last entry haunted me there inside. I had to get out of the house. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and left without looking back. My car felt like a sanctuary, the doors locked and the engine humming softly. I didn't have a destination in mind, I just needed to be somewhere else. As I drove, the events of the past few nights looped through my mind like a broken record. The man in the crimson suit, his silent companions, the tapping, the grin. None of it made sense. But I couldn't deny what I'd seen. I ended up at the library, hoping to find anything that could explain what was happening. I was sitting at a corner table with a stack of old newspaper archives and local history books. The librarians had been helpful, if a little skeptical, when I asked about strange sightings or urban legends in the area. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. A faded article from the early 1980s detailed the disappearance of a local man named Daniel Pierce. The last person to see him alive claimed that Pierce had been ranting about figures in crimson suits following him. He disappeared a week later, leaving behind an empty house and no clues. Another article from the 1960s told a similar story. A woman named Margaret Hayes reported seeing a man in a red coat outside her home for several nights in a row. She described him as motionless, silent, and impossibly still. The article mentioned that Margaret was later found wandering the woods, incoherent and unable to explain how she got there. I flipped through more clippings, my dread growing with each one. Every decade or so, another story surfaced: sightings of a man in crimson, strange disappearances, people vanishing without a trace. The descriptions were eerily consistent. The crimson suit, the stillness, the staring, and in every case the pattern was the same. At first he stayed outside watching. Then he came closer. Finally he came inside. By the time I left the library, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The drive home felt like a march to the gallows. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to keep going, to leave town, to never look back. But I couldn't. Not yet. If the man in the crimson suit had followed others before me, running wouldn't stop him. He would find me no matter where I went. As I pulled into my driveway, the sight of the house sent a fresh wave of dread washing over me. The windows stared back at me like empty eyes, and the shadows inside felt darker than they should have been. I sat in the car for several minutes, gripping the steering wheel and trying to summon the courage to go inside. Finally, I forced myself to move. The house was silent, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was the heavy, oppressive silence that felt alive, as though it was waiting for something. I went to the living room and grabbed the journal, clutching it tightly as I paced back and forth. My mind raced with questions. Why was this happening to me? What did he want? The answer came in the form of a soft creak from the second floor. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the ceiling, listening. Another creak. Co. And then, faintly, the sound of footsteps. My legs felt like jelly as I crept toward the stairs, the journal still clutched in one hand. Each step felt like a lifetime, the tension in my chest building with every inch closer to the top. The hallway was empty, the doors to the bedrooms and bathroom all closed, but the footsteps continued, moving slowly, deliberately, as though someone was pacing back and forth just out of sight. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stood frozen, staring down the hall, waiting for anything to happen. Then came the tapping, soft and rhythmic. It echoed faintly from my bedroom door. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air biting against my skin. My breath came in. Gasps as I backed away from the house, my eyes fixed on the windows. For a moment, nothing happened. The house stood quiet and still, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights. And then I saw him. The man in the crimson suit was standing in my bedroom window, his head tilted to the side, his grin wide and gleaming. Behind him, two shadowy figures loomed, their forms indistinct but unmistakably there. I stumbled back further, nearly tripping over the curb. They weren't just outside anymore. They were inside. I stood frozen in the street, my eyes locked on the figure in my bedroom window. His grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, as though mocking my terror. Behind him, the shadowy figures loomed, their heads tilted at unnatural angles, their forms blending with the darkness of the room. My chest tightened, and my breaths came in short, panicked gasps. They were inside, not outside the window, not on the street inside my house. I didn't know what to do. Running seemed pointless. Calling the police even more so. They'd never believed me before, and I doubted they'd start now. But I couldn't just stand there. My legs felt like they were moving on their own as I stumbled backward, retreating toward the safety of my car. I fumbled with the door handle, my fingers trembling so violently that it took 3 tries before I managed to unlock it. I threw myself inside and locked the doors, gripping the steering wheel as though it could anchor me. For a moment, the car felt safe. The faint hum of the engine, the solid feel of the doors at all, created the illusion of a barrier between me and whatever was inside the house. But then I glanced at the rearview mirror. My blood ran cold. The man in the crimson suit was standing in the middle of the street, directly behind my car. His grin was gone now, replaced by a blank, hollow expression that somehow felt even worse. His head tilted slightly, his eyes those empty, black voids boring into mine through the mirror. He didn't move. Neither did I. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in place, staring at him through the mirror. Time felt meaningless, every second stretching into an eternity. And then, without warning, he raised his hand and pointed. Not at me. At the house. I followed his gesture, my gaze snapping back to the window where I'd first seen him. The shadowy figures were still there, their forms writhing and shifting like smoke. But now, there was something else. The lights in the house began to flicker, casting the rooms in erratic flashes of light and shadow. I could hear faint sounds from inside, whispers, taps, the groan of floorboards under heavy footsteps. The house itself seemed to be alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy that made my stomach churn. The man in the crimson suit tilted his head further, as though waiting for me to do something. I shook my head, my grip on the steering wheel tightening. No, I whispered, though my voice was barely audible. I'm not going back in there. But the man didn't move. He simply stared, his hand still pointing toward the house. And then the car's engine sputtered and died. The sudden silence was deafening. I twisted the key in the ignition, my heart pounding as the engine refused to start. The lights on the dashboard flickered once, then went dark. Panic surged through me as I glanced back at the mirror. He was gone. My stomach dropped. I twisted in my seat, my eyes scanning the empty street, the driveway, the yard. There was no sign of him, no crimson suit, no shadowy form. But the house. The front door was wide open. A chill swept over me, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The house seemed to be waiting, its dark interior yawning like a mouth ready to swallow me whole. No, I said again, louder this time, as though saying it out loud would make any difference. But the compulsion to move was overwhelming. I didn't want to go back inside, but it was as if something was pulling me, dragging me toward the open door. I stepped out of the car, my legs shaking so badly that I almost collapsed. The night air was cold, against my skin, carrying an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The driveway felt endless as I crossed it, each step heavier than the last. The house loomed before me, its dark windows staring back like empty eyes. When I reached the door, I stopped, my hand hovering over the frame. Inside, the whispers grew louder. They weren't words, at least, not any I could understand, but they filled the air like 1,000 voices speaking at once. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The whispers stopped. And then, from somewhere deep inside the house, I heard it. The tapping. It was coming from the living room. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. The air was thick, oppressive, carrying the faint smell of decay. The lights flickered above me, casting erratic shadows across the walls. The tapping grew louder as I moved toward the living room, my feet dragging against the floor. When I rounded the corner, I saw him. The man in the crimson suit was standing in the middle of the room, his grin back in place, his black eyes fixed on me. Behind him, the shadowy figures stretched and twisted, their forms merging with the darkness of the room. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a single step forward, his movements smooth and deliberate. The shadows behind him followed, their shapes flickering and contorting with every step he took. My back hit the wall as I stumbled away, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. "You don't belong here," I said, though the words sounded weak, almost laughable. His grin widened. And then, in a voice that was both too soft and too loud, he spoke for the first time. "I'm already here." His words echoed in the room, reverberating through the walls like a slow, rolling thunder. "I'm already here." Owl. The shadows twisted and surged, creeping along the floor and walls like living things. I stumbled backward, clutching the edge of the wall for support. My mind raced, grasping at anything, a plan, an escape, something. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, though my voice trembled. The man in the crimson suit didn't answer. He took another step forward, and with each movement, the shadows around him grew darker, thicker, until they swallowed the room. Entirely. Entirely. Then the whispers began again, louder and more distinct this time. They weren't just noises anymore, they were voices. "You invited us," and one voice hissed. "This is our home now," another growled. "There's no escape," they all chorused, their tone a blend of malice and glee. Something snapped in me then. "No," I screamed, pushing myself off the wall. "This isn't your home. It's mine." I didn't know where the courage came from. Maybe it was the anger, the frustration of being terrorized night after night. Or maybe it was sheer desperation. The journal. The thought hit me like a lightning bolt. I'd read the entries, seen how others had suffered. But none of them had fought back. They'd let the Crimson Man and his companions consume them, drive them to madness. Not me. I grabbed the journal from the coffee table, flipping through its brittle pages until I found the last entry there inside. "I won't let you take me," I shouted, holding the journal up as if it were a shield. The man in the crimson suit tilted his head, his grin faltering for the first time. The shadows recoiled slightly, as though sensing my defiance. I didn't wait for him to act. With trembling hands, I tore the page from the journal and set it on. fire with the lighter I kept in my pocket. The effect was immediate. The shadows writhed violently, the whispers rising into a deafening roar. The man in the crimson suit lunged forward, his movements no longer slow and deliberate but frantic, desperate. The fire consumed the page quickly, the flames licking at my fingers before I dropped the charred remains onto the floor. "Leave," I screamed, my voice cracking under the strain. "You don't belong here." The man in the crimson suit stopped abruptly, his hollow eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Then he smiled. Not the wide, malicious grin I'd grown used to, but something else, something colder, more calculated. "This isn't the end," he said, his voice low and sinister. "I'll always be watching." The shadows exploded outward, engulfing the room in a blinding wave of darkness. When the light returned, they were gone. The room was silent, the air still. The journal lay on the floor, untouched, its pages blank now, as though it had never been written in. I collapsed onto the couch, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. My heart raced as I stared at the empty space where the crimson man had stood. It was over. It was over. Days turned into weeks, and the house was quiet. The oppressive air was gone, replaced by a stillness that felt normal, but I wasn't the same. At night, I kept every light on, unable to sleep in the dark. Every shadow, every faint noise sent. My heart racing. And then, one night, I saw it again. Not him. Not the man in the crimson suit. But a flash of red just out of the corner of my eye. I turned, but nothing was there. For now. Because deep down, I knew he wasn't gone. Not really. Have you ever experienced a haunting presence or felt like someone was watching you? Tell us your story, we're ready to be creeped out.